The Catholic Morning Show on Iowa Catholic Radio.
Welcome back to the Catholic Morning Show. It is 15 minutes after the hour, and we are grateful you have joined us on Iowa Catholic Radio. I'm Bo Bonner, hosting your morning here. Elise is letting us know the news of the day. Ayden manning the wheels of steel back there behind the board. And Deacon Tony is keeping us up to date on our prayers. On the second half of the show, we'll speak with Patrick Callahan, director of the Newman Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture out by the University of Nebraska, and assistant professor of English and Humanities at St. Gregory the Great Seminary. But right now, let's turn to Father Innocent Smith, a Dominican friar who teaches at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. He has recently given a talk called Aquinas the DJ, Musical Memes and the Liturgy of Corpus Christi. And when I saw this talk being advertised, I had to ask if he would come on the show and talk about the themes. Father, thank you for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure. Great to be with you.
It is beyond perfect. Did you mean to schedule talking to us on the Feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, or was that just pure providence?
Well, it's providence insofar as you offered several dates, and I thought this would be the perfect date of those you offered. So that's kind of, in a way, how Thomas Aquinas and divine providence work.
That's
God
what
always disposes and then makes it possible for us to respond.
Absolutely. I was going to say the same thing. Thomas Aquinas teaching lessons even in radio show scheduling. Father, one of the things, of course, beyond calling Aquinas a DJ, that's an amazing way to put it. I know out of the gate, I'm already impressed with the title because so often people think of Thomas Aquinas as the big brain who, of course, talks about philosophy and theology, obviously all true. But I'm often aware that Thomas Aquinas is probably most known through history via the Corpus Christi prayers. That it's actually his poetry that has probably made the biggest impact in Western Christianity. And so to think about Aquinas musically and poetically first, I think is very critical for most people to sort of get at the heart of the great saint.
I totally agree with that. I would say part of the reason I like the Aquinas the DJ idea is a DJ doesn't create music from scratch. He or she draws on other music and then does something new and interesting with it. And that's precisely what Thomas does in his poetry, because he's drawing on older melodies, and the melodies themselves are part of what he's trying to transmit. He's telling you something through his choice of music, as well as through the new words he's composing. So I think there's a great connectedness of the music and the poetry in Aquinas' life and thought.
And then, I know this makes me a vain person, but when anybody ever, says an idea that you've thrown out before, you feel vindicated, like you're not a crazy person. So, for instance, I've told people that I really think the Middle Ages, the closest thing we have sort of arising in modern contemporary times that gets at a medieval sensibility is actually memes. And I usually get laughed down at this one, but I go, no, when people act like the Middle Ages, just the Dark Ages, it was just sort of retransmitting the ancients. I similarly say this is when people wrongfully think that there's not a lot of ingenuity and creativity, but also deep recognition when the kids, as I call them as an old man, have a sort of tradition of memes. I'm not being silly and acting like they're absolute equivalents, but I really do think that one way we misunderstand the Middle Ages, that we could maybe get more insight, is this idea of memes, sort of remixing ideas to speak to new issues.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, the subtitle of my talk the other day at Notre Dame was Musical Memes and the Liturgy of Corpus Christi. And the argument I was making was precisely along the lines you're suggesting. It's that Thomas is expecting a shared culture for those who are hearing and also singing his music. And so his meanings are not just on a verbal level. I think we often are very overly rationalistic, but also it's a shared culture. So it's like when you hear a parody of a song, you kind of, if you know the original song, like say with Weird Al Yankovic, you can kind of appreciate his ingenuity in making something new. But if you know the original song, you can sort of also get the sense of the tension between the original, like say take Gangster's Paradise and Amish Paradise. Mm-hmm. Amish Paradise is a funny song in itself, but if you can think about the juxtapositions, it's quite, it's a different level. And it's similar with Aquinas in the liturgy, because he himself was a deeply musical and liturgical man. He was constantly steeped in the liturgy, and he expects those who are listening and singing along with him to have a similar shared culture. So I think it's all about, for us today, how do we kind of take the positive aspects of meme culture, but also how do we enliven ourselves in that participation in the broader liturgical tradition of the church, so that we can kind of have that sensibility, that shared culture.
I think that's one reason why Thomas Aquinas gets stereotyped as sort of the sterile, like you said, overly rationalistic. You can hear certain arguments if you go down the rabbit trail that, you know, with Thomas Aquinas, the West became hopelessly entangled in sort of philosophical, arguments and lost its soul and sort of lost its poetic liturgical basis. But I actually think the problem's with us. It's not Thomas's fault that we don't understand, like you said, not only the deep verbal resonances, but even the sort of formal ones that he knows that all he has to do, as you said, is like wink and nod at certain liturgical facts, traditions, and that a whole host of associations would come flooding into people's minds. Do you think that is maybe one of the things that is important for scholars like you to let people know, is that sometimes if someone from the past seems too dry and rationalistic, it's because we are missing some of the context that would give it more depth and liveliness.
I think that's totally true. I mean, think about, like, what will each of us leave behind? What can people study of us 100 years from now? It might actually just be like our tax records or something like that. Something that's really well documented, but that doesn't necessarily give the whole person. I think it's similar with Aquinas. You know, he was a teacher first and foremost, a preacher, and we only have a tiny bit of his preaching and teaching preserved. It's, fills many books actually, but his output was so much more vast, and I think that's true for each of us. So we have to really do an imaginative reconstruction if we want to really understand not just his words, but his whole spirit. I remember for me one kind of breakthrough in this process when I was first studying Thomas Aquinas in a serious way. I happened to read a book about life in medieval Paris. So Thomas Aquinas was born in Italy, but he spent a good deal of his life in Paris, which was really the center of the academic world at that point. And I remember in this book, there was just this brief discussion of monkeys in Paris. I happen to love monkeys, and it describes how, there were various kind of people who had these pet monkeys around. So for me, that was very interesting to think about Thomas walking through the streets of Paris, on his way to class and seeing these little monkeys playing around. It helps us to kind of break out of our dogmatic slumber of assuming that he's the sort of kind of boring person who just produces words. No, he was a person who loved to sing. He probably enjoyed the monkeys, just as I do. But I think, every time we're trying to understand another person, especially people we disagree with, it's very important to try to understand their wholeness rather than just kind of some aspect of who they are.
Amen. I know that we don't have tons of time, but can you give, you had a whole paper on this, and if it's recorded, I'm going to go track it down because this sounds great. Can you give us one example of where he has a musical meme, something he remixes for the Liturgy of Corpus Christi?
Yeah, so I think the most interesting example is his hymn Verbum Supernum Prodiens. So that's one where people know it mostly today from the O Salutaris Hostia, the last two verses, which are sung at the opening of benediction. But what Thomas is doing is he's actually drawing on the text of an Advent hymn. So he's making us think about the beginning of Christ's life. But then he's drawing on the melody of the hymn for the Feast of the Ascension. So that's making us think of the end of Christ's earthly life. So if you don't know those sources, you can still appreciate his hymn on its own terms. But the more you understand that resonance, the more you can see he's making this really profound point about the Eucharist being this source of connection with every part of Christ's mystery, his earthly life as well as his heavenly life. So I think that's a great example of the meme culture, that Thomas is steeped in this. He expects us to know it, but, it doesn't rely on us knowing that in order to still appreciate it on its surface level.
Well, on one hand, that's absolutely beautiful, and now I will think about that every time. I guess the question I have for you here at the end is, so for us that are now excited about this idea, On one hand, we have jobs, we have kids. It's not going to be probably up to us to figure out medieval memes. What's the best way for this sort of stuff to disseminate into the church? Is this maybe something for preachers to take seriously? To say that letting in at least glimpses of these sort of deep connections can help the faithful understand the liturgy better?
I think that's true. I mean, I think the most important thing is to see that the liturgy is not just a duty or obligation. It is that. But much more so, it's a sacred banquet. It's a joyful encounter with the Lord. And so I think being able to see the humor in the liturgy is something that can really help us encounter it more fully, not just as something we have to do, but something we really want to do. So I think preachers can play a role in that. I think parents can play a role in that, helping their children to cultivate the right spirit. I mean, I know sometimes you need a certain sort of discipline, but also just this sense of what are we aiming towards? It's ultimately this joyful, free participation.
Oh, that's absolutely beautiful. Father, do you know if this whole talk is going to be up on YouTube or anything like that?
So it's going to be available. I'm going to give some other versions of it coming up, one for the Thomistic Institute at Cornell University in a couple of weeks. So I'm not sure if the whole thing's going to become available online, but it's something that I'll be looking forward to sharing with some other audiences as well.
Okay, wonderful, because this, yes, you got to spread this far and wide. Father Innocent Smith, friar, a Dominican friar who teaches at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. This has been an absolutely wonderful talk. I don't know a better way to celebrate Aquinas' feast day than to talk about his deep musical remix formation. Father Innocent Smith, thank you for coming on the Catholic Morning Show.
My pleasure.
Man, I'm going to be thinking about that for days.
The Catholic Morning Show is a production of the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. To hear this and other programs, visit iowacatholicradio.com or download the Iowa Catholic Radio app.